Hey, you're listening to Night Tide. Today I'll walk you through a question that sits under a lot of family dinners and quiet arguments in cars. The question of why so many of us, after years of swearing we'd do it differently, end up sounding like our mothers or fathers anyway. Not in appearance, in tone, in timing, in the small, unspoken rules we suddenly find ourselves enforcing. It matters because it touches something most of us think we control completely, and that assumption might not survive the hour. Write in the comments what time it is where you are right now, or just tell me how your day went. There are genuinely thoughtful, warm people in the comments section of this show, and reading through them is one of the better parts of putting this together. And if you're enjoying Night Tide, there's a link in the description where you can support the project. What we're circling tonight isn't really about parents at all. Not in the end. It's about the mechanisms that produce a person's choices. The invisible scaffolding installed long before anyone had the language to question it. We inherit that scaffolding more reliably than we inherit any specific decision our parents made. A father's short temper isn't handed down as a fact to be agreed with or rejected. It's handed down as a nervous system setting, a default speed at which frustration turns into volume. This idea runs through several layers, each stranger than the last. There's the physical layer, the body copying gesture and rhythm before a child can form an opinion about any of it. There's the relational layer, the templates for how closeness and distance are supposed to work, absorbed the way a language is absorbed, without a textbook. There's the layer of power, since every home runs on some understanding of who commands and who complies, and children learn that structure long before they learn its justification. And there's an economic layer too, quieter than the others, where attitudes about money and risk get passed down with unusual precision because they were never taught as opinions. They were taught as survival. Underneath all of it sits a harder question, one we won't answer neatly tonight, or maybe ever. When someone catches themselves saying a parent's exact phrase in a parent's exact tone to someone who never even met that parent, what exactly is happening? Is that a failure to become a separate person? A kind of quiet defeat? Or is it the only way a person actually manages to continue past the point where their own life ends, moving through someone else's mouth, uninvited and maybe uninvitable? I'm not going to pretend there's comfort waiting at the far end of this. What I can offer is a way of looking at the pattern closely enough that it stops feeling like fate and starts feeling like structure, which is at least something a person can study. Structure has seams. Fate doesn't. Consider how early this actually starts. Long before a child can argue with a parent, agree with a parent, or even understand what a parent is asking of them, the body has already begun its work of imitation. Watch an infant's face when a parent's voice sharpens, and you'll see the muscles respond before any comprehension could possibly be present. That response gets rehearsed over and over across thousands of ordinary moments no one thinks to record. By the time language arrives and a child can finally ask, "Why does this house feel the way it feels?" the answer is already written into muscle, breath, and posture. Language shows up late to a party the body has been attending for years. This is why a grown adult can insist, entirely sincerely, that they've made a conscious decision to parent differently, to argue differently, to love differently, and still find their shoulders rising toward their ears in the exact configuration their own mother's shoulders used to rise. The decision was real, it just wasn't first. It arrived after the pattern, dressed up as its cause. There's a reason this matters beyond family, beyond any single household. If the earliest and most persistent programming happens below the level of conscious agreement, then a great deal of what we call personality, and even a fair amount of what we call values, might be closer to inherited architecture than to anything freely built. That doesn't erase the person standing in the structure. It just means the structure was there first, quietly furnishing the rooms before anyone moved in and called the place their own. Watch a child stand at a stove they're too young to reach, tilting their head at the exact angle a parent tilts it while stirring something on low heat. No one taught that tilt. No one demonstrated it on purpose. It simply migrated, the way heat migrates through metal, from one body into a smaller one standing close enough to absorb it. The claim worth sitting with here is a plain one. What gets called a choice later in life, when someone reacts to stress or comfort or conflict in a way that mirrors a parent almost exactly, is frequently the replay of a program that was installed before consent was a category the child could even use. There was no moment of agreement. There was only proximity, repetition, and a nervous system doing what nervous systems do, which is learn from whatever pattern surrounds it most consistently. This forces a shift in how the word choice gets used at all. In ordinary conversation, a choice implies a moment of weighing options, a small internal parliament voting on what to do next. But a great deal of behavior around stress, around comfort, around the exact way frustration turns into a raised voice or a closed door, skips that parliament completely. It runs through older, faster circuitry, the kind built in the first years of life, when a parent's exhale or tightened jaw was the entire available vocabulary for what safety or danger meant. A child doesn't interpret that vocabulary. A child becomes fluent in it, the way anyone becomes fluent in a first language, without ever consciously studying grammar. The insight that follows is uncomfortable precisely because it's so ordinary. You can tell yourself with total sincerity that you've decided to handle disappointment differently than your father did, or to soften a tone your mother never softened. And you can mean that decision completely, but the muscles in your face may already be moving before the decision finishes forming, because they were trained on a schedule that has nothing to do with your current intentions. The intention arrives late. It often arrives after the reaction has already started, offering itself as the reason for something it didn't actually initiate. There's a strange comfort people reach for here, imagining that awareness alone should be enough to override this kind of early wiring. If you can see the pattern, surely you can simply choose not to repeat it. But seeing a pattern and overriding a pattern draw on entirely different resources. Seeing happens in the part of the mind that narrates. Overriding requires retraining a reflex, which takes repetition of its own, sustained over time under exactly the kind of pressure that used to trigger the old response in the first place. Insight without that retraining tends to produce someone who reacts the old way and then narrates the new way immediately afterward, which can look, from a short distance, indistinguishable from genuine change. This is where the boundary of the idea has to be drawn honestly. None of this means a person is powerless, or that the body's early programming is destiny in some fixed, unbreakable sense. Reflexes can be retrained. Nervous systems remain plastic well into adulthood, and repeated, deliberate practice under real conditions does shift what the body defaults to. But the retraining has to happen at the same level where the original learning happened, in the body, under real stress, over real time. It cannot happen only in the part of the mind that talks, reflects, and explains, because that part was never where the original pattern lived in the first place. So when you catch your own hand moving toward your face in the exact gesture your mother used when she was trying not to cry, or you hear your own voice drop into your father's exact register of quiet warning, you're not necessarily watching a failure of will. You're watching a program that predates will, run for the 10,000th time, still faster than the sentence you're forming about it. Whether that program can be rewritten, and how much of you would remain once it was, is a question this exploration keeps circling back toward, without ever quite landing. What does it actually mean to say someone inherited their parents' attachment style? The phrase gets used so often, it stops meaning anything specific, as if attachment were a trait sitting quietly in a person's temperament, waiting to surface. That description misses what's really being transmitted. Attachment isn't a trait at all. It's a setting in the nervous system, a learned answer to one particular question asked over and over in early life. What happens when I need someone and they're not immediately available? The answer a child receives hundreds of times before memory can even hold individual instances becomes the baseline the body defaults to for the rest of its life whenever closeness is at stake. This is where the tension sits, because most people believe they'd recognize their parents' imprint if it showed up in their own relationships. They expect to hear the same words, catch the same complaints, notice the same demands, repeating themselves in a new decade. But words are the least reliable place to look. Words can be edited, rehearsed, even reversed on purpose. Timing can't. The exact pause before someone answers a partner's text, the precise moment withdrawal kicks in during an argument, not sooner, not later. The specific interval it takes for someone to forgive after being hurt. An interval that feels entirely personal, entirely their own, until you notice it lines up almost exactly with how long a parent used to wait before speaking to them again after a fight. Nobody copies a script that closely by accident. What's being copied is rhythm, and rhythm is far harder to catch in the mirror than content. The insight worth sitting with is that a nervous system doesn't store lessons the way a mind stores facts. It stores procedures. It learns very early whether reaching out for comfort tends to be met or ignored, whether a need expressed loudly gets a response faster than a need expressed quietly, whether closeness is generally safe or generally followed by some kind of cost. None of this arrives as a sentence a child could repeat back. It arrives as a felt sense of timing, an internal clock calibrated to a parent's actual behavior rather than their intentions or their explanations. Years later, that clock is still running, quietly setting the pace for how someone loves, how long they wait before trusting, how quickly they brace when things go well for too long. You can watch this in something as small as how a person handles a partner going quiet for an afternoon. Some people barely register it. Others feel a specific, familiar dread arrive at almost the same interval every time. A dread that has very little to do with the actual partner and everything to do with a much older silence, the kind that used to stretch across a childhood kitchen after a parent got upset and simply stopped talking for a while. The current relationship becomes the stage. The timing belongs to something decades older. Here's where the human cost becomes hard to look at directly. A person can spend real effort trying to love someone the opposite way their parents loved each other, choosing more openness, more explicit reassurance, fewer punishing silences. And still, under enough pressure, the old interval reasserts itself. They pull back at the exact beat their withdrawing parent used to pull back at, even while insisting out loud that they're staying present. The content of the relationship has changed completely. The tempo hasn't moved at all. That gap between what someone is trying to build and what their timing keeps enacting without asking permission
is where a lot of quiet suffering in adult relationships actually lives, mistaken by both partners for incompatibility or bad luck, rather than recognized as inherited rhythm. There's no full resolution to offer here, only a narrower way of watching. If you want to see what actually got passed down to you, it helps far more to track intervals than opinions. How long before you answer someone who's upset with you? How long before you forgive? And whether that length has ever really varied, no matter who you're forgiving. How fast affection turns into suspicion when it starts to feel unfamiliar and good. Those numbers, those private, unspoken durations, carry more inherited history than almost anything you'd ever put into words. Changing them seems to require more than intention, since intention operates in language, and this material was never built out of language to begin with. Whether it can be retimed at all, and through what kind of sustained pressure, is a question this exploration is far from finished with. There's a particular kind of promise people make to themselves, usually somewhere in their 20s, sometimes earlier if the household demanded it sooner. I will never raise my voice like that. I will never go silent for 3 days over something small. I will never let money control the room the way it controlled every room I grew up in. The promise feels like the beginning of a separate life, a clean break, the first plank of a bridge leading away from a specific house and toward a version of adulthood that owes nothing to it.
Here's the paradox worth naming directly. The very act of building that bridge requires constant reference to the shore you're leaving. You can't refuse to raise your voice like your father without measuring in real time whether your voice is rising the way his did. You can't avoid your mother's 3 days of silence without tracking, almost obsessively, how long you've gone without speaking to someone you're upset with. The refusal only works if the original pattern stays loaded in memory, active, ready to be checked against at every relevant moment. So the very discipline of not becoming someone keeps that someone installed at the center of your attention permanently. This is the shape of the trap. Opposition isn't distance. It's a kind of orbit. A planet doesn't escape a star by refusing to be the star. It escapes by leaving the gravitational field entirely, and almost nobody manages that with a parent because the field isn't made of admiration or affection alone. It's made of relevance. As long as a person remains the coordinate system you use to measure your own behavior, you are still moving in relation to them, still organizing your choices around their position, even if every single choice is the mirror opposite of what they would have done. People try to resolve this the obvious way, by increasing the distance. Move further from the reaction. Overcorrect harder. If a parent was cold, become almost aggressively warm. If a parent controlled every dollar, spend without a second thought, refuse to track anything, treat budgeting itself like contamination. This feels like escape because it produces behavior that looks nothing like the original. But overcorrection is still calibrated entirely by the thing it's overcorrecting against. The amount of warmth someone forces into a relationship, the amount of carelessness someone performs around money, is set by measuring the original coldness or control and then multiplying the opposite. That's not an independent value. That's a value derived entirely from the original, just run through a different sign. You can push the logic further, and it gets worse before it gets clearer. Someone who swore never to be controlling can become so afraid of resembling their parent that they refuse to set any boundary at all, even when a boundary would help everyone involved, because boundary setting itself now reads, in their private symbolic system, as the first move toward becoming the person they fled. The parent's shadow doesn't just shape what gets repeated. It starts vetoing perfectly reasonable behavior too, simply because that behavior sits anywhere near the feared category. The rebellion, in trying to protect its own independence, ends up restricting the range of choices available even further than the original pattern did.
Why can't this be resolved by simply noticing it? The way people assume insight should fix things, because the noticing still happens inside the same reference frame. You can observe with total clarity that you're only reacting to your father and not actually choosing freely. And that observation still requires holding your father at the center of the frame in order to make the comparison at all. There's no clean exit available through more awareness, because awareness of an orbit doesn't remove the gravity producing it. It just gives the orbit a narrator. What this costs in ordinary life is a specific kind of exhaustion that rarely gets named correctly. People report feeling like they're always reacting, always defending a position, always slightly on alert against becoming something, and they call this vigilance maturity, or self-awareness, or growth. Often it's just fatigue from permanent proximity to a gravitational field they never actually left. The energy spent avoiding a parent's pattern is not neutral. It's energy borrowed from whatever life might have existed if that parent had simply stopped being the reference point altogether. There's no tidy way out offered here, only a narrower honesty. If your no is louder than your yes, if your identity is built primarily from a list of things you refuse to become, the shore hasn't been left behind. It's just been renamed as the horizon you're rowing away from, forever, at exactly the distance the rowing allows. The version of a parent that most people carry around as the enemy, the one they've built an entire adult identity around avoiding, gets treated as reliable. It feels like a fact, retrieved rather than constructed, a straightforward record of what actually happened in that house. This assumption sits underneath almost every promise someone makes about not becoming their mother or their father. The reasoning goes something like this: I remember exactly how he was. I remember exactly what she did. My rejection is built on evidence, so my rejection is sound. The trouble is that memory of a parent formed in childhood was never built with adult tools. It was assembled by a mind still learning language, still working out cause and effect, still incapable of holding two things true about a person at once. A child doesn't have the cognitive machinery to think, my father was frightened, and that's why his voice went hard. Or, my mother was exhausted past any reasonable limit, and that's why she disappeared into her room for hours. A child registers the hard voice. A child registers the closed door. What gets stored is the surface event, stripped of any context that might have softened it. Because context requires a kind of psychological distance a young nervous system doesn't have access to yet. So the record laid down isn't really a record of the parent. It's a record of how a small, overwhelmed person interpreted a moment they didn't have the resources to interpret accurately. That record then freezes. This is the part people rarely account for. The interpretation doesn't get revised as the child grows older, gathers more information, learns what pressures the parent was actually under. It sits in storage at the emotional age it was formed, untouched by everything learned afterward, waiting to be triggered by anything that resembles it. Someone can grow into a thoughtful, emotionally literate adult, capable of understanding nuance in every other part of their life, and still carry, completely unrevised, the 6-year-old's reading of a father's temper. A reading formed before that child even had the vocabulary for anger, let alone the vocabulary for fear disguised as anger. You can watch this play out in something as ordinary as flinching at a tone of voice. A person might swear they will never speak to their own children the way their father spoke to them, picturing a specific sharpness, a specific volume, and organizing years of careful, gentle parenting around avoiding exactly that. What they are actually avoiding, though, is a 6-year-old's memory of maybe a dozen bad evenings during one particularly hard year. Evenings a grown man might barely remember, or remember completely differently. Because the ordinary, unremarkable 90% of the relationship never got encoded with the same intensity. The child kept the worst frames. The worst frames became the whole file.
This complicates the entire project of rebellion in a way most people never examine. If the parent someone is fighting against is largely a construction, formed under duress, frozen at a young age, then a great deal of adult effort gets spent negotiating with a phantom rather than a person. The real parent, the one who existed in full, contradictory, changing, aging, sometimes cruel and sometimes gentle within the same week, gets replaced by a flattened figure who exists only to be refused. And here's the strange consequence. Refusing a flattened figure is easier than refusing a real one. So the flattening itself becomes useful, almost necessary, for the rebellion to feel clean and justified. Keeping the memory distorted protects the resolve. What passes from one generation to the next, in this specific sense, is a copy of a copy. Not the parent as they were, and not even the child's accurate memory of them, but the child's old, frightened first draft of who that parent must have been. A draft that never got the chance to be edited by anything learned later. You end up organizing your adult choices around a figure who may never have fully existed in the form you're resisting, shaped instead by whatever a much younger version of you was capable of understanding at the time the wound was made. Whatever gets carried forward from that house travels through this distortion first, and there's no way to know, from inside it, how much of what you're determined never to become was ever accurate to begin with, or how much of it was simply the shape fear takes when it has nowhere else to go. There's an old disagreement about where the voice in your head actually comes from, and it never quite gets settled, because both sides are partly right, and neither side can prove the other wrong. One position treats your inner monologue as the clearest evidence of a private, sovereign self, the commentary that judges your day, second-guesses your decisions, tells you to calm down or push harder, feels like the most intimate thing about you, closer than your face, closer than your name. The other position, older and less comfortable, treats that same voice as borrowed speech. Not something you generated, but something you absorbed, word for word, tone for tone, from the first person who spoke to you with authority before you had any language of your own to answer back. These two views don't stay separate for long. They meet at a specific, almost embarrassing moment, the moment you catch a phrase leaving your own mouth in a cadence that isn't yours. Someone hears themselves say, "Don't be so dramatic," to their own child, in the exact rhythm, the exact clipped impatience their mother used decades earlier, though the mother has been gone for years, and the phrase was never consciously kept. The sentence surfaces on its own, fully formed, already fitted to the situation, arriving faster than any deliberate thought could have produced it. That speed is the tell. Deliberate thought takes a beat. Inherited phrasing doesn't, because it was never composed in the moment. It was installed long before, and it activates the way reflexes activate, without asking permission. This is where the two positions stop contradicting each other and start describing the same event from different distances. The voice does feel private, because by adulthood, it's the only voice you've got access to from the inside. And the voice is also inherited, because a significant portion of what fills it was placed there before you could evaluate, refuse, or edit any of it. Sovereignty and inheritance turn out to be describing the same mechanism at two different points in its history. What started as someone else's judgment, heard from outside, delivered in a specific voice, at a specific volume, in a specific room, gets folded inward over enough repetition that it stops sounding like a memory and starts sounding like thought itself. What never resolves, no matter how closely you examine it, is where the line sits between what you generated and what you received. There's no marker in the archive of your own mind that says this sentence is original and this one is inherited. Once a phrase has been repeated enough times in your own private narration, it takes on the texture of your own voice completely, indistinguishable in tone, indistinguishable in authority, arriving with the same unquestioned weight as anything you might have concluded on your own. You can trace some of it back if you work hard enough, if you sit with a specific, harsh judgment long enough to recognize whose cadence it's wearing. But most of it stays untraceable, absorbed too early, repeated too often, blended too completely into what simply sounds like you thinking.
This matters far beyond the households people grew up in. It's relevant every single day, in the ordinary, private, unremarkable stream of self-talk that runs constantly, underneath almost everything you do, judging your effort, rating your worth, deciding whether you deserve rest or deserve to keep pushing. Much of that stream is not really commentary on your life. It's transmission, still running, still delivering someone else's verdicts in someone else's voice, long after that person has stopped speaking, sometimes long after they've stopped existing at all. The parent becomes internal narration precisely because the voice never had to announce itself as theirs. It just kept talking, in the first person, using your mouth, and at some point, there was no one left to correct the record. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into a house after something goes wrong, and it doesn't announce itself as anything. No one sits the children down and explains what happened. No one names the fight, the diagnosis, the debt, the affair, the loss. The subject simply stops being mentioned, and a certain tightness enters the room whenever anything adjacent to it comes close. A child growing up inside that house learns the tightness perfectly. They learn exactly which words make a parent's shoulders rise, exactly which topics get answered with a change of subject, exactly which door, closed a little too quickly, means something is being kept out of reach. None of this arrives as information. It arrives as weather. This is the specific mechanism worth slowing down on, because it explains something that trips people up constantly when they try to trace where their anxieties actually came from. Someone can spend years searching their childhood for the story that would justify a particular fear, a particular flinch, a particular dread that shows up whenever a certain kind of quiet falls over a room, and find nothing. No event, no memory that fits. And the reason there's nothing to find is that the transmission never took the form of an event in the first place. It took the form of tone. A parent's unexplained tension around a subject gets absorbed by a child long before the child has any concept that a subject exists to be tense about. What gets inherited isn't the content of what happened. It's the body's rehearsed response to something it was never told about, repeated often enough that the response outlives any memory of its cause.
Widen this out, and you start to see how much of what people carry forward has nothing to do with explicit lessons at all. Parents rarely sit children down and teach fear directly. Fear moves through smaller channels, a held breath, a sentence that stops halfway, a subject that gets skipped over at dinner 3 times in a row without comment. A person raised around a parent's unspoken grief will often grow into an adult
who feels a low, specific dread near certain kinds of loss without ever being able to name whose loss it originally belonged to. A person raised around a parent's unspoken shame about money will often flinch at conversations about spending, long before they understand why the flinch is there. The avoidance itself becomes the lesson. What was never said gets taught more thoroughly than what was. You can watch how this outpaces almost every other form of inheritance in terms of reliability. Explicit instruction can be questioned. A child can hear a rule stated out loud and decide, even quietly, even without saying so, that the rule is wrong, that it doesn't apply to them, that they'll do differently. Atmosphere doesn't offer that opening. You can't argue with a tone you absorbed before you had the concept of arguing. You can't reject a silence because a silence never made a claim you could evaluate and refuse. It just conditioned your nervous system to brace at a certain frequency, and bracing doesn't require your agreement. Here is where the account runs into its own limit, and it's worth naming plainly rather than smoothing over. If trauma travels mainly through tone and silence rather than through explicit story, then a huge portion of what gets passed down is, by its nature, undocumented. There's no sentence to trace it back to, no single moment you can point at and say, "This is where it entered me." What you're left with instead is a felt pattern with no attached explanation, a bracing with no clear origin, a dread that shows up on schedule but refuses to hand over its history. You can feel the shape of the thing perfectly and still be unable to describe what it actually is, because the very method by which it was transmitted was designed, without anyone intending it, to leave nothing behind that language could hold on to. This is a strange kind of cost to carry. It means you can be shaped decisively by something you were never given the words for, something no one in your family ever described, something that might not even correspond to a single identifiable wound so much as an accumulated climate held over years. You inherit the weather without inheriting the forecast, and whatever unease that leaves in you doesn't resolve simply because you've noticed it's there. Noticing gives you a name for the shape. It doesn't hand you the missing sentence that would finally explain where it came from. Every household runs on a constitution nobody drafted and nobody signed, and yet everyone inside it knows the terms by heart before they can read a single word. Who gets the last say at dinner? Whose mood sets the temperature of the room? Which complaints get heard and which get treated as noise? Which silences are safe to sit in and which ones mean you should leave the room quietly and not ask why? This is a system of governance, functioning exactly the way any small government functions, with a distribution of power, a method of enforcing it, and a set of consequences for whoever tests its limits.
What matters is the order in which a child absorbs this. Long before there's any explicit content to argue about, long before a child could tell you what the family believes about money, about honesty, about how anger should be expressed, the child has already learned how power moves through the house. They know, at a level beneath words, whether disagreement is permitted or whether it's treated as a threat to the whole structure. They know whether forgiveness is quick or has to be earned back slowly through some unspoken probation. They know whether the person who yells loudest wins or whether the person who goes silent longest wins instead. This is absorbed as structure, not as belief, which means it survives independent of whatever explicit values the family claims to hold. A household can preach fairness at the dinner table while running, underneath, on a strict and unspoken hierarchy that contradicts everything just said out loud. The child learns the hierarchy. The words about fairness mostly evaporate. This is worth sitting with because it reframes something people usually treat as a matter of personality. When someone grows up and finds themselves, without quite choosing to,
replicating a parent's way of running a room, the same use of silence as leverage, the same tendency to make disagreement cost something. They tend to describe this as a character flaw, something they need to correct in themselves as an individual failing. But what's actually being reproduced is a governing logic, a whole operating system for how power should distribute itself among people who live close together. That system was rehearsed for years, daily, without anyone ever describing it as a system at all. It was just how the house worked. And a person doesn't need to agree with a regime in order to run one. You can hate the way you were governed and still govern the same way. Because what got absorbed wasn't a set of opinions you could reject. It was a structure you were trained into, before opinions were even possible. Here's where the pattern widens past any one household, because the same logic scales upward without much modification. A generation raised inside authoritarian households tends to build institutions that quietly reflect that authority. And a generation raised inside households built on negotiation tends to build institutions that expect negotiation as the default. Look at how a school disciplines its students, how a workplace treats dissent, how a legal system decides who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. Somewhere underneath the official policy, there's usually a familiar shape. The shape of somebody's childhood living room, scaled up and dressed in more formal language. Institutions rarely invent their approach to power from nothing. They inherit it, the same way a person inherits it, from whichever domestic regime shaped the people who built them. And this is where the account runs into a gap it can't quite close. If the logic of power gets absorbed before its content, then changing your explicit beliefs about fairness, about authority, about how disagreement should be handled, may do far less than you'd hope. You can adopt an entirely new philosophy of how people ought to treat each other, and still find your hands running the old regime the moment stress arrives, the moment stakes rise, the moment the room gets tense and the earliest training reasserts itself faster than any belief can intervene. What you were taught to think is available to your conscious mind. What you were trained to do under pressure often isn't.
The regime survives changes in ideology because it was never installed as ideology in the first place. It was installed as behavior, at an age when there was no ideology yet to filter it through. And that leaves you governing certain moments of your life according to a constitution you never actually read. Watch what happens the next time you're out to eat with someone and the bill arrives. Some people glance at it once and move on. Others do a quiet arithmetic under the table, checking who ordered what, running a tally they don't need and can't quite stop running. That reflex rarely comes from a personality trait like caution or generosity. It comes from a much older accounting system, learned at a kitchen table decades earlier, where a parent's face did something specific whenever an unexpected cost appeared. You absorbed the calculation before you understood what it was calculating for. This is worth expanding into a wider principle, because money behaves differently from almost anything else a family passes down. Someone can inherit a parent's sense of humor loosely, a parent's taste in music barely at all, a parent's opinions selectively, keeping some and discarding others as life gives them reasons to disagree. Financial patterns don't sort themselves so easily. Scarcity, once learned as a survival condition rather than a preference, tends to persist through every later change in circumstance because it was never filed away as an idea a person could weigh and reject. It was filed away as a threat response, tuned to specific triggers, an unpaid bill, a silence after a purchase, a look that crossed a parent's face at the sight of a receipt. None of that requires belief to keep functioning. It only requires memory at the level of the body, and the body remembers threat far more reliably than it remembers reasoning. Push this further, and the shape of the principle gets clearer.
A household teaches its children a working theory of risk long before it teaches them the price of anything specific. Some households train a nervous system to treat every purchase as a small emergency, worth debating, worth guilt, worth secrecy, if it happened at all. Other households train the opposite, a fluency with spending that borders on indifference to consequence, money as a substance that will simply appear again. Neither one gets handed down as a lesson someone could argue with over dinner. It arrives as posture, as the exact tension in a parent's hands while paying for groceries, and a child copies posture long before they copy conviction. Now, stretch this principle to its limit and see where it starts to strain. Take someone who grew up with real scarcity and later, through work or luck or simple time, ends up with more money than their parents ever had. You'd expect the old fear to fade once the actual danger is gone. Often it doesn't. The reflex keeps firing on a threat that no longer exists, producing behavior that looks, from the outside, almost comic in its mismatch with the person's actual bank balance. Someone with substantial savings can still feel a jolt of dread buying something entirely ordinary, still hide purchases, still calculate a tip with the intensity of someone counting rent money. The nervous system was trained for a specific emergency and never received updated information, because updated information isn't the kind of thing a nervous system knows how to process. It processes patterns, not statements. And a bank balance is a statement. It rarely reaches the part of a person that was frightened first. Here, the principle actually breaks, or at least splits into two directions that don't resolve cleanly. In some cases, the old caution keeps a person from disaster even after the original threat is gone, a kind of protective instinct that outlives its usefulness without becoming harmful. In other cases, it curdles into something closer to self-punishment, a person denying themselves comfort they can plainly afford, driven by a fear their circumstances no longer justify. You can't tell from the outside which version you're looking at, and often the person living it can't either. The same inherited caution that once kept a family fed can, decades later, and in a completely different financial reality, keep an individual from ever feeling safe enough to rest. What this leaves you with is a strange kind of inheritance that doesn't respond to updated facts the way you'd expect facts to work on anyone. You can show the nervous system every piece of evidence that the emergency is over. It will thank you for the information and keep bracing anyway, because it was never listening to information in the first place. It was listening to tone, to posture, to the tension in a parent's hands at a checkout counter, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that no later spreadsheet, however convincing, quite reaches the part of you that learned to be afraid first.
A school building doesn't run on the policies printed in its handbook. It runs on something closer to instinct, a set of assumptions about who deserves patience and who deserves punishment, absorbed by the adults who designed it long before any of them wrote a single rule down. That instinct came from somewhere. It came from the households those adults grew up in, the same way a person's private habits came from a household. Except now the habit has been given a building, a budget, and the authority to shape a few thousand children at once. This is worth stating plainly, because it changes what an institution actually is. A school, a court, a workplace, a government agency, these get treated as neutral machinery, systems designed on paper by people applying reason to a problem. In practice, they function more like a family that has been given legal standing. Someone still decides who gets the benefit of the doubt. Someone still decides which behavior counts as defiance and which counts as a reasonable request. Someone still decides how quickly forgiveness arrives after a mistake, and how long a person has to sit in disgrace before they're let back into the group.
These decisions rarely trace back to a philosophy carefully worked out in a meeting room. They trace back to whatever governing logic the people in charge absorbed as children, at an age when they weren't choosing a philosophy of anything. They were just learning how their house worked. The key insight sits in the transfer itself, in how completely a private structure can move into a public one without anyone noticing the move happened. Picture a workplace where disagreement gets treated quietly as disloyalty, where the people who raise concerns get sidelined rather than heard, and where forgiveness for an honest mistake is measured out slowly, like a punishment dressed up as process. Nobody in that workplace wrote a manual describing it this way. The manual probably says something about open communication and mutual respect. But the actual current running underneath the words was set by whoever built the culture. And whoever built it was shaped years earlier by a house that ran the exact same way, where a raised concern meant trouble and a mistake meant a slow climb back into favor. The institution didn't invent its own logic. It borrowed one from a source nobody in the building has ever met.
This scales in ways that are easy to miss because the scale is so large it stops looking personal. Look at how an era disciplines its children in schools, and you're often looking at a magnified version of how that era's parents were raised themselves. A period that valued strict obedience in the home tends to produce institutions that expect obedience without much explanation. A period that shifted toward negotiation and explanation at the kitchen table tends to produce workplaces and schools that expect the same, that treat every rule as something owed an argument. You can watch a whole society's disciplinary style shift over a generation and trace it back, at least partly, to a shift in how that generation was put to bed as children, how disagreement was handled at their own dinner tables, whether a raised voice meant danger or just conversation. Civilizations don't invent their systems of authority from abstract principles. It inherited them the same way a person inherits a temper, absorbed before there was any name for what was being absorbed. Here's what this does to how you might see the institutions around you. A law, a company policy, a school's disciplinary code. These carry the appearance of deliberate design, something built by careful people solving a problem with reason. Underneath that appearance often sits an inherited posture, a domestic instinct given official paper, and a badge of legitimacy. You obey a workplace hierarchy that feels oddly familiar not because it's objectively correct, but because it rhymes with something you already knew from childhood, something that trained your body to comply with this particular shape of authority long before you ever signed an employment contract. And this is where the line gets hard to hold steady. If institutions inherit parenting ideologies, the way children inherit tone and timing, then reforming an institution by rewriting its rules may accomplish far less than it appears to. You can change the handbook. You can retrain the staff on paper. The underlying instinct, the reflex about who gets believed and who gets blamed, may keep operating exactly as before, because it was never installed through the handbook in the first place. It was installed the same way it's installed in a child. Through years of unspoken practice that no revision can quite reach. Somewhere between the family and the institution, the inheritance keeps moving, and nobody signed off on where it lands next.
Ask yourself when you last made a decision that felt entirely your own, from the first impulse to the final action, with no earlier moment quietly steering the outcome before you noticed you were choosing. Most people, pressed on this, will describe an instant of decision, a clean point where they weighed options and picked one. What they rarely examine
is how much of the weighing had already happened somewhere below the point where attention arrived. By the time you feel yourself choosing, the choosing may already be mostly finished. There's a real tension buried in this, one that most people avoid looking at directly because it threatens something they'd rather keep intact. You want to believe that your reactions in a relationship, your instinct about when to push and when to retreat, your habit of going quiet during conflict or filling silence with over-explanation, come from your own accumulated wisdom about what works. It feels earned. It feels like judgment refined over years of trial and error. But judgment refined over years of trial and error, and a pattern installed decades earlier by watching two people navigate their own conflict, can produce identical behavior. And from the inside, there's no reliable way to tell which one you're actually running. The insight worth sitting with is that the mind is extremely good at supplying reasons after the fact for actions it did not originate. This isn't a flaw specific to a few people, it's closer to a standing feature of how thought works. A behavior fires, shaped by something learned long before reflection was possible, and then a narrator arrives just afterward, calm and articulate, offering a story about why you did what you did. The story sounds like reasoning. It has the cadence of reasoning, but its actual job is closer to translation, taking an action that already happened and dressing it in the language of intention so that it reads, to you and to anyone watching, as something chosen rather than something completed. This becomes sharper once you notice how often the story changes without the behavior changing at all. You can watch someone withdraw from a partner the moment things get difficult, and hear them describe it, this time, as protecting their peace, and hear them describe the identical withdrawal a year earlier as needing space to think. Different justification, same motor sequence, same timing down to the day. The behavior is stable. The authorship narrative is the flexible part, generated after the fact to fit whatever self-image is currently in use. If the explanation were actually driving the action, you'd expect the action to shift when the explanation shifts. It usually doesn't. The human cost of this is quieter than it sounds, but it accumulates. If a decision is partly pattern completion wearing the mask of deliberate choice, then a person can spend years believing they've grown, believing they've become more thoughtful or more patient, while the underlying sequence, the exact moment they shut down or the exact moment they overcommit, hasn't actually moved. Growth, in this reading, sometimes means nothing more than acquiring a more sophisticated vocabulary for describing the same old motion. You feel wiser. The behavior disagrees with you.
There's also a colder cost sitting underneath the personal one, which is what this does to blame and credit. The two things people most want to assign clearly. If a habit of controlling a partner's schedule, or a habit of disappearing during arguments, or a habit of managing money through secrecy runs mostly on inherited architecture, completing itself, then praising someone for restraint or condemning them for repeating an old failure both rest on shakier ground than either judgment assumes. You can still hold someone responsible for what they do, but responsibility built on the idea of a fully authoring self starts to look less like a fact and more like a convenient simplification, useful for courtrooms and conversations, less accurate the closer you look at where an action actually originates. None of this resolves neatly, and it isn't meant to. What it offers instead is a narrower, more honest question to carry forward. Not whether you're free, since that framing tends to produce only defensiveness or despair, but whether the story you're telling yourself right now about why you just did something matches the timing of the action itself or arrived a beat too late to have caused it.
That gap, small as it looks, is where most of what people call personality is actually sitting, quietly finishing sentences the conscious mind believes it started. There is a version of this you can hold only late at night, when the defenses that usually manage the question have gone quiet enough to let it through. The version where becoming your parent is a diagnosis, and there is another version sitting right beside it, where becoming your parent is the only way anything of them, or anything of you, gets to keep moving through the world once the two of you are no longer standing in the same room. Both versions are true at the same time, which is exactly the difficulty. Nothing here resolves that. It only lets you see the shape of it clearly enough to stop expecting a resolution. Think about the nervous system that learned, before it had words, when to reach for someone and when to brace instead. That template didn't vanish when you grew older and started making your own choices about love. It became the quiet architecture behind every relationship you've had. The reason you know, without deciding, exactly when to go still during a disagreement. You called that instinct. It was closer to inheritance, wearing the clothes of instinct, and it will keep operating in your own children's nervous systems whether you ever explain it to them or not. That is not a failure of individuation. It is the mechanism itself, doing precisely what it was built to do, which is outlast the person who built it. Think about the voice that surfaces in your own mouth, aimed at someone who never knew the person it originally belonged to. You felt that moment. A phrase leaves you in a tone you didn't choose, and for half a second you hear someone else speaking through your throat. That's not haunting, in the way the word usually implies. It's closer to continuation, the only kind available once a person can no longer act directly in the world. Their sentence still gets said, their timing still lands somewhere. You are the place it lands.
And think about the story you tell yourself right after you do something. The one that arrives a beat late and calls itself a reason. If that story is often narration rather than authorship, then the part of you that swore never to repeat a parent's pattern was never fully in control of preventing it either. The vow was real, the vigilance was real. But vigilance runs on the same architecture it's trying to supervise, and the supervisor was built by the very household it's now guarding against. This is why the harder someone studies a pattern to avoid it, the more precisely that pattern gets rehearsed in the studying. Awareness doesn't lift you outside the mechanism, it just gives the mechanism a more articulate witness. Put those three things next to each other, and the earlier question changes shape. It stops being about whether you'll turn into your parents because in tone, in timing, in the exact geometry of your reactions, you already have, long before this conversation, long before any vow. The real question is what that repetition is for. Whether it's a life failing to become distinct, or whether distinctness was never the assignment. Whether continuity, even flawed continuity, even continuity carrying old damage forward into new rooms, is the closest thing to permanence a person is ever handed. Nature didn't build minds to end cleanly at the border of one body. It built them to leak into the next generation, however imperfectly, and call that leaking love or a burden, depending on the day. If tonight left something in you that wants a longer conversation, that's worth sitting with rather than solving before sleep. None of this comes with an instruction to fix or a clean cycle to break, because the cycle is also the bridge. It carried a voice forward that would otherwise have ended completely. It carried timing and tone and an entire private way of surviving difficulty, none of which asked your permission to keep existing.
You didn't choose most of what you're carrying. You get to choose, in small and incomplete ways, what you do with the fact that you're carrying it. And that choosing, however partial, however late it arrives after the behavior it claims to explain, is still yours in the only sense that has ever mattered. Not clean authorship, just presence. Awake inside an old mechanism, watching it run, sometimes gently redirecting it, most of the time simply being it, and calling that being alive. Good night.